Dzień dobry, witamy wszystkich na kolejnym spotkaniu Innovators Club. Znowu słyszałem, mieliśmy problemy z filmem, ale mam nadzieję, że wszystko wkleimy. Potem będzie wyglądało na naszej stronie internetowej OK. Witamy wszystkim. To już, Pawle, które nasze spotkanie?
10.
Dziesiąte spotkanie Innovators Club. Szczerze mówiąc, nie spodziewaliśmy, że ta inicjatywa będzie się aż tak dobrze i dynamicznie rozwijać. Wiemy już jedną rzecz, że za każdym razem jest problem z filmem prawie jakiś, ale pracujemy nad tym, damy sobie radę. Zapraszamy Państwa do naszej grupy na w Facebooku, zapraszamy do grupy i na stronę na LinkedInie oraz na naszą stronę. Tam informujemy w Innovators Club o kolejnych spotkaniach. Pawle, czy powinniśmy coś dodać? Kto będzie następny?
Następny webinar w środę. Jego gościem będzie Antonio Nieto Rodriguez, międzynarodowy ekspert w obszarze zarządzania projektami.
Super. Dziękuję. A teraz nam nie pozostaje nic innego, jak przedstawić najpierw moderatora, znanego człowieka od polskich mediów, znany z projektów bardzo udanych i mniej udanych, o których też pewnie coś powie, ale bardzo, bardzo doświadczonego. Witamy doktora Grzegorza Lindenberga. And Grzegorz, the floor is yours.
Dziękuję bardzo. To jest pierwszy raz, kiedy ja występuję jako moderator na Zoomie i w ogóle drugi raz, kiedy używam Zooma w życiu, więc za wszelkie błędy niestety będę ja musiał ponieść odpowiedzialność, ale mam nadzieję, że wszystko pójdzie dobrze. I have a pleasure today to introduce Mr. Edward Roussel, who is a Chief Innovation Officer at Dow Jones company. Dow Jones is a publisher of one of two biggest digital newspapers in the world, Wall Street Journal, that alongside of New York Times has 2 million digital subscribers, which is an incredible achievement. Edward was, before joining Dow Jones, worked for Bloomberg and worked for the Telegraph Media Group in London. So he has long experience of digital innovations in the media, and what I noticed is all the media he worked for were charging readers for their content basically from the very beginning, and I hope that he will tell us a few words about the business ideas of developing new media. Edward, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for having me, first of all. And let me start by saying that I hope everybody is well. I know that these are very challenging times globally. In the US, it's gone from being a health crisis to an economic crisis, and now a social challenge, a social crisis. So these are very challenging times. The theme today is about how Silicon Valley is innovating in news. And I think that this is a very important theme because I'm based here in New York. I moved to New York 7 years ago because I'm fascinated about how technology is changing the news industry. But what we're seeing, what we've been seeing more recently, is a real acceleration of the interest that the big Silicon Valley companies are having in news. And this creates a number of different challenges. The first one is it really fundamentally changes the competitive landscape of news in America, and I think ultimately in the world. Because if you take the Wall Street Journal, for example, our historic competitor is probably the New York Times and probably Bloomberg. But now all of a sudden, in our management meetings, we're talking far more about Facebook, Apple, Google, and the impact that these companies are having on our business. So it's changing the competitive landscape. second issue is one of scale. The 5 largest companies in America are also the 5 largest companies in the world. Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, Google. These are Facebook. These are the 5 largest companies in terms of market cap. They have a combined market capitalization. 5 companies have a combined market value of $5 trillion. So their ability to really impact any industry that they choose to focus on is substantial. The third reason is these are the most technologically adept companies, arguably in the world. And given that the currency of the 21st century economy is technology, these are companies that we have to take very seriously. And so I'm interested in, I'm a member of the executive committee at Dow Jones. And I'm interested in the fact that a lot of the time when we talk about competitors, people are still not thinking about the big tech platforms as competitors. So if you take away one theme from the discussion today, it's that we need to be talking a lot more, if you're interested in the news business, you need to be talking a lot more about the impact of the big 5 technology companies on our business. So with that, I'm going to show you just a few slides, and I hope that illustrate the point. Do let me know if these come up on your screen. I'm going to start broadcasting now. Okay, can you
Yes.
can you see my screen? Okay, great.
Yes, we can.
Great. So let me start with this. These are significant investments in the news industry. What they have in common with their initiatives is that they all see news as a way of bringing audiences back to their products. So Microsoft, for example, has kicked off a project called Enterprise News, which aims to integrate news into Office 365 software. And that's significant because it means that if you're a business user of news, why would you go and pick up a newspaper, or why would you go to a website when in the context of your working environment, you can access news that's not only of a high quality, but that's probably relevant to the document you're writing right now. So that's Microsoft. Snap has been doing a number of experiments with news, and you may be familiar with the Discover platform. And the Discover platform was launched about 5 years ago, but they're now launching a new project called Happening Now, which hasn't yet launched in Poland, but it's just an experimental phase in the US, which is a short form, concise news summary. Facebook has launched in the US only at the moment, but it will be coming to Europe, I think, in a year or so, something called the Facebook News tab. This means that within the Facebook application now, at the bottom of the Facebook application, there's a tab which brings in high quality news sources. And that's important for Facebook at a time when they're trying to counter the perception of misinformation on their platform. Apple has launched in 4 countries now, in the US, in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, something called Apple News Plus, which again is a curated collection of news from high quality publishers. And Google's focus on news has really been around voice activation of news. So they now provide, through Google Home, these very short digests of news called Yours News Update, using voice assistant technology. So what interests me in this is the quote you'll see on the right-hand side of this slide, which is from Bill Gates, which is, at the moment, the big tech companies are in a highly experimental phase with news. And they're testing out different models. They're using technologies to try to define a better news experience. But the real question is not so much what are they doing today, but what could they do over a 5 to 10 year period? And bear in mind that the big 5 technology companies so if you take one technology company, Microsoft, it's already in terms of its market value the size of the entire media sector in America. So what these companies could do with the news business over time is significant. So what are they doing? What are they doing with news that's particularly compelling, even provocative? And I've summarized the work that they're doing into these 5 themes. First of all, I think the big tech companies are very mindful about how we interact with mobile technology. And so they're very good at condensed news experiences that are consistent with how we use mobile phones. So the average person uses their mobile phone about 100 times in the day, but in very short bursts, on average for about 3 minutes. And I'll give you examples of how technology companies are redesigning the news experience to provide people with a great experience in very short bursts of time. Secondly, there's a huge amount of innovation around audio. And audio really breaks into 2 parts. First of all, there's voice assistant technology. So voice is replacing search as a way to access the news or the sport that you want. And secondly, the content of news is becoming increasingly voice orientated. It's not just podcasts, this is also how news is surfaced on voice assistant technology. Video is undergoing an extraordinary transformation. And you can see it on today's call, right? We're all communicating on Zoom technology, Google Hangouts technology, Microsoft Teams technology. So video is fundamentally changing the way that we communicate. That's only one way in which video is changing, if you like, the business of content and communication. The other significant way is short form video content on mobile. So think about Instagram stories or stories on Snapchat. And then thirdly, think about streaming services such as Netflix and how that's replacing television. So video, huge amount of innovation going on there. Fourthly, you have this interesting question which comes back to how we find the stories that are relevant to us. And what the big technology companies are innovating with is AI technology that helps us not only personalize content, find stories that are relevant to us, but also write content as well. So we're having early stage examples now of robots writing stories about whether the stock market is up or down, or which football team won a particular match. And largely, we're seeing a lot of innovation around hyper-local news. And I'm sure it's the same in Poland, but local newspapers in America have been decimated. They're in the last stages of their lives, and it's being replaced by new news-related apps, which integrates geolocation software to serve the right experience. So across these 5 areas, we're seeing a significant level of innovation from the large Silicon Valley companies. And let me give you a few examples, and let me start with brevity. So as I was mentioning before, when you're consuming news on a mobile phone, you're consuming it in very short, bite-sized chunks. And that's difficult for companies that have, for example, a newspaper legacy like the Wall Street Journal or some of the significant newspapers in your market. Because the user experience, if you have news on the web or news in a newspaper, is for people to sit down and read for lengthy periods of time, 10, 15, 20 minutes. What happens in mobile is that people will give you on average 3 minutes of their time, 3 minutes. So you've got 3 minutes to give people a great news experience. And one thing that we know about the internet is the internet relentlessly drives productivity. So if you look at news consumption over time, the amount of time that people are spending reading news on the web is actually diminishing. It's come down 10% on average in the past 5 years. The amount of time that people are spending reading newspapers has also come down. So as people have got more and more used to mobile technology, so there's this compression in time about the amount of time that people will dedicate reading news. So being able to deliver news of high quality in short bursts of time is becoming incredibly important. And if you're looking for an example of how this is being done well, I think Snapchat is a really interesting example. What Snapchat will tell you is that when you look at news on Snapchat, on the Discover platform, the data from Snapchat shows that you've got 2 seconds to get a reader's attention. So in other words, from the time where they see a headline and they see a photograph, you've got 2 seconds on average for that person to determine whether they're going to read any further. So you've really got to capture the interest of a reader very fast on mobile. In Snapchat as well, people spend on average 80 seconds, a minute and a half, less than a minute and a half, reading a full set of content, a collection of 4 or 5 stories. And this is why Snapchat is now just experimenting with something that you won't have seen yet, but you'll find will be coming probably to the market in Europe sometime next year, which is this happening now experience, which is we have a collection of 5 stories, but each story is down to, it can be read or watched in less than, I'd say, 30 seconds. So the point about this is that there is a lot of innovation around concision and how people consume news in short form on mobile devices. Second area of innovation, audio. And really, I think we've got to start thinking about audio being something that's accessible anywhere. So smart speakers, I'm sure as popular in Poland as they are in the US, but smart speakers are now in 53 million US homes. More than roughly a third of US homes now has a smart speaker. So that's one way in which audio content is being accessed today in a way that it wasn't being accessed 5 years ago. Then you've got the prevalence of audio technology in cars. So more than half of new cars in America either have Android Auto or Apple CarPlay. And again, this unlocks a vast array of audio content that we can now access in the car. And then on the go, the big explosion in terms of technology is the AirPods, the thing I've got in my ears at the moment. And according to analyst estimates, AirPods, Apple will sell 100 million AirPods this year. That's 100 million AirPods. So this is a category of products that didn't exist for Apple 3 or 4 years ago, but this year could be worth more than $10 billion in revenue. So if you put all that together, the big picture is one of audio everywhere, whether you're in the home, in the car, or out and about in the streets. That, of course, is spurring a revolution on the content side. And part of what I'm seeing is companies like Apple that are planning to launch in the course of this year, the ability to not only read stories on the Apple News platform, but also create audio playlists of stories that you can click on and then listen on your AirPods when you're out and about or in the car. Google is experimenting with streaming news updates so that you can simply ask your voice assistant for the news, and it provides you with these updated and hyper-localized news updates. And Spotify is buying a lot of podcasting companies. They've spent $600 million buying Gimlet, Anchor, Parcast, Ringer, The Joe Rogan Show over the past 18 months. So there's an example of a music company that's tilting more towards content that feels more similar to news. So the big picture here is the hardware is becoming ubiquitous. It is meaning that audio can be listened to everywhere. And that's triggering this incredible revolution and innovation on the content side. So that's theme number 2. Theme number 3 is video. And you'll all be familiar with the explosion in video. And we're experiencing right here on this call. But I think you can really break it down into these 3 areas. First of all, video communication. And this is becoming particularly intense during the pandemic. This battle between Microsoft, Google, Zoom, Verizon, for the corporate markets, the corporate market for video communication. And then in the consumer market, you've got companies such as Houseparty, Instagram, WhatsApp, or Facebook Rooms that are competing for video communications on our smartphones. So that's one significant area of innovation in video communication. The second is that video is taking over social media. Just think about TikTok and the incredible growth of TikTok in the past couple of years. Think about what people can now do with a camera in terms of storytelling, in terms of filming, in terms of filtering, in terms of creating polls, in terms of the use of geolocation software to be able to feed stories to people within a radius of 5 to 10 miles. And think about the volume of video that's now being consumed on platforms such as Instagram. 500 million people a day watching Instagram stories. So social media is increasingly becoming video social media. It's becoming one and the same. So that's, again, another very significant shift. And the third one is, the streaming services are crushing television. And in the US, it's not just about Netflix, it's also Disney Plus, it's Apple TV Plus, it's Amazon Prime, it's AT&T, which has bought HBO. And those companies combined will spend $60 billion this year alone on creating content. Now, you may ask, how does that impact news? And that is that it's helping spur a renaissance in documentary making. That may be a small part of the overall entertainment business, but it's very encouraging. And these are some of the documentaries that have struck me in the recent months. American Factory, fascinating story about a culture clash between Chinese entrepreneurs and American entrepreneurs. Asif Kapadia's documentaries, anything that he makes is really great, but I'd strongly recommend his documentary on Maradona. And The Devil Next Door, which is, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's a Netflix series about a Nazi that escaped to the US. So all that to say that video is changing almost by the month, but we have to think deeply about how video is impacting the news business, given that this is going to be probably the dominant way in which people are exchanging and consuming content. Which brings me to the fourth theme, which is how technology companies are using AI to improve news experiences. And this is very disruptive for traditional news companies, because traditional news companies are not strong on technology, and they're very strong on editing and journalists. And obviously, journalists and editors will remain incredibly important today, tomorrow, 10 years, 20 years from now. But what I think we'll increasingly see is some combination of man and machine working in conjunction. And here you've got some examples of companies that are doing that. So LinkedIn employs 65 journalists to help select stories, but they also use algorithms to bring to the top of your feed stories that they think are most relevant to you. Both Facebook and Apple, in their news products, which again haven't yet launched in Poland, but have launched in the US at this point, again, it's a mixture of editors and algorithms. So editors may choose the top stories, but algorithms are choosing the stories that are most relevant to you based on perhaps signals such as your previous reading behavior or stories that are relevant to the one that you're particularly reading. And of course, we're familiar with Netflix and how Netflix uses AI. But really, when you've got such enormous collections, I think Facebook has about 14,000 collections of film and platform in each country. Being able to surface the 4 or 5 categories that are most relevant to you is incredibly important. So these are really examples of how people, so in other words, editors and algorithms, are coming together and fusing together. And I like this quote from Peter Thiel, one of the great people in venture capital in America, which is that the end game isn't about computers and the end game isn't about humans. It's really about how computers and humans interact to create better experiences. And so then the last theme I'll focus on is hyperlocal news, because what we're seeing at the moment is fascinating, and I expect you're probably seeing something similar in Poland, which is, what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. So the collapse of local newspapers, which is spawning a renaissance in mobile local news. So I'm very fascinated by this app, and I don't know whether it exists in Poland, but it's getting more and more currency in the US, called Citizen, which provides hyper-local breaking news. And at a time when there's rioting and looting in New York and in my neighborhood, being able to see where the activity is taking place on an app like that is incredibly compelling, and it's in real time. And again, it's with video, and it's using geolocation software. Really, really powerful. Nextdoor is another example, rather different from Citizen. It's more about community shopping, community support. but again, very powerful. And again, it uses the geolocation software in your phone to determine the content that's relevant for you. And Newsbreak, which is one of the most downloaded apps in the US in the past few months, which provides AI-driven news personalization based on your location. So all that to say that when people talk about, the death of local news, they don't really mean the death of local news. They mean the death of the local newspapers, because what's coming through right now is a new generation of mobile-driven tools that do really an incredible job of informing people of what's going on in their neighborhood by leveraging the power of mobile technology. So I'll end with that, and maybe we can open to questions and answers. But I'll end by with where I started, which is to say that if you're in the news business, it's not that you need to respond to all of these trends that are coming through in Silicon Valley, but you do need to be aware of them. And you do need to be thinking about, how does this impact your business? How does this impact your customers? Not just over the next 6 to 12 months, but really over the next 5 to 10 years. Because I think that the news industry, if one looks back over the past 25 years, has been a laggard with technology. And the problem when you're a laggard with technology is by the time you catch up, it can be too late. So my message to you is keep an eye on what the Silicon Valley companies are doing. Embrace the technology that they are coming up with in order to create great news experiences, but be mindful that the world is changing very fast. So with that, I'll stop showing my screen and open up to questions.
Okay, I muted myself. I hope, can you hear me, Edward?
Yes, I can.
You hear me?
Yes.
I'd like to begin with some personal questions to you. First, basically, I have two questions. One is, what does a chief innovation officer do? Are you a leader or a cheerleader for innovations? Somebody, okay.
That's a great question. Well,
okay, the second question is, of all these trends that you see, what makes you happy personally? Not as a chief innovation officer, but as a person consuming the news. What makes you happy, and what makes you worried?
Well, those are two great questions. Let me start with the second one and come back to the first. I mean, in terms of what makes me happy, what makes me happy is applications like Citizen. And I don't know whether that's available yet in Poland, but it's a very powerful application that does hyperlocal news. And the hyperlocal news is delivered by its users. So last Friday, I saw this incredible protest in Brooklyn, where I live. And if you look at the Citizen app, that video is being uploaded, is being shared. So people who aren't at the protest can see what's going on and can make decisions about what to do. What I like about it is it's about the community, it's about citizens creating the news. And what I like about it is it's about being really smart about what the mobile phone can do. So the mobile phone has geolocation software, so it can tell me within a certain radius of where I live what's going on. And a mobile phone can shoot videos and upload videos. And to me, this is a revolutionary way of telling the news. So it gets me excited. It gets me excited. What I like less is how the big technology platforms are turning news into a commodity. So when you look at the screen of your Samsung phone or your Apple phone, everything looks the same. There's the vertical scroll and what we call these cards, these widgets with a headline, a picture, a summary. And whether it's Twitter, whether it's the Facebook stream, or whether it's your local newspaper, everything seems to look the same. And yeah, that worries me because it feels like it's the commodification of news. And what's great about news, and I'm thinking now in the back of my mind about some of the early free newspapers in Poland that were highly experimental after 1989, and how brave they were with their designs and their branding. It was really very inspiring. And so you don't want to commodify that. You don't want it to go into a straitjacket and for everything to look the same. It strips out the personality of these brands. So those are examples of things that excite me and also things that worry me. In terms of your very good question of what does a chief innovation officer do? So I have three roles. I do sit on the executive committee of Dow Jones. So I do help set strategy for the group. I do also manage our relationships with the big technology companies. So I'm the person who negotiates with Apple, with Google and Facebook and Amazon. And we have business relationships with all of those companies. Part of that job is being able to navigate what we call frenemy territory. So they're both our friends and they're our enemies. And being able to understand how these platforms can help us better deliver news, but making sure that we're getting paid, making sure that it's net additive to our business as opposed to something that is damaging to our business. And the third thing I do is I run a number of projects that is designed to accelerate our transformation to digital. For example, I'm looking at a project right now about the digitization of conferences. Up until 3 months ago, we had an $80 million a year conferences division. That conferences division has disappeared overnight with the pandemic. And so the exercise we have underway, which is urgent, is how to create great experiences using digital technology. Another example of a project that I'm leading is about how to better, it's an advertising related project, how to better target C-suite executives using the Wall Street Journal as a brand. So I sponsor a number of projects that are designed to accelerate our digital transformation, and that's really my job. Am I a cheerleader? I'm a skeptic more than a cheerleader. So I think a lot of my job is to not get excited about technology, is to say, listen, forget about this, it's not going to help us. So, for example, my team spent a bit of time looking at virtual reality a few years ago, and our conclusion was the market's not ready for it. Let's not waste any time on this. Let's move on. So sometimes my job is to be a cheerleader, but sometimes my job is to be a skeptic.
I have a related question from our audience. How do you introduce innovation to Dow Jones? Can you share any case studies or best practices how to introduce innovations in media companies?
Well, I think first of all, the number one step, I think, is to define a very narrowly focused pain point that you're trying to solve for your consumers. So take, for example, mobile and the transition to mobile, which is underway for some time now, but it's changing all the time. What a mobile phone is has changed dramatically over the past 10 years. So how do you leverage the power of a mobile phone to give a better experience, but also how are consumers consuming news on mobile? And I think if you look at the history of news on digitally, we've always tried to shoehorn the old technology into the new technology. So we've always tried to take newspaper. 25 years ago, we took the newspaper and we put it on the web. 13 years ago, when the iPhone launched, we took the web content and we put it into a phone interface. But actually, I think what an innovative person does is they think about the consumer experience more profoundly. So, and I'll come back to the example I gave in the presentation, which is if people, when they access their phone, look at their phone for just 3 minutes of time on average, how do you create a great news experience in 3 minutes? How do you design a news experience around the user behavior that's already established? And so what I try to do with my colleagues is say, let's start by defining a consumer pain point. And that's an example. Okay, consumers are going to give us 3 minutes. What's the best way that we can give them a great experience of news in 3 minutes? And how do we get them to come back later in the day for another 3 minutes, and maybe a third time in the day for another 3 minutes? So in aggregate, it's not just 3 minutes, it's 9 minutes or 10 minutes. So what I try to do is be very, very narrowly focused on very specific pain points, and then be highly experimental with the prototypes we come up with. And then the third bit is to test them, rigorously in the marketplace. So if you take digital events, for example, our digital business has gone from $80 million to zero very quickly. How do we now build up from that? But how do we create a great experience of an event, of a conference, if you like, using digital technology, where the definition of success is people will pay for it. But to answer the question, in my view, it's about being very clear what problem you're trying to solve, and then being very experimental and testing relentlessly over a period of many weeks or months with consumers to get their feedback.
Another question from from the audience is the approach to innovation you have at Dow Jones and Wall Street Journal something extraordinary compared to other magazines, or is there a chief innovation officer position in other magazines as well?
I think in a perfect world, my job wouldn't exist. In other words, people who work in news media would all be sufficiently tuned into the shifting dynamics of the marketplace that you wouldn't need someone like me. Back in the real world, you need somebody within your organization, I think, that's really focused on where the world is headed. Not where the world is today, but where the world is heading. And so those people don't necessarily have the title of Chief Innovation Officer. Sometimes it's Chief Technology Officer. Sometimes it's CEO. I think the best Chief Innovation Officers are CEOs. And they should be. But you need to have someone in your organization that's challenging the organization about where the market is heading. And I think if that wasn't clear before, it should be clear now in the current environment in which we're operating, where overnight the whole of the Western world has become working from home digital technologies. And thinking through what the implications of that are for all of our businesses is incredibly profound. And thinking about it not just in terms of a time frame of 2 to 3 months, but over a time frame of 2 to 3 years is also incredibly important.
So basically you're saying that any company needs a chief devil's advocate position, not to make mistakes, being over optimistic and deluded by possibilities.
Well, there's real tension between focusing on today's revenues and tomorrow's revenues. And the problem about having management teams that are just focused on today's revenues is they ultimately get disrupted. And if you just think about what's happened to advertising in the news business. So today, 75% of digital advertising in America is controlled by just 2 companies, by Facebook and Google. But the news sector has had 25 years to get used to the fact that there's going to be disruption to advertising with web-based technologies, and has really done very little about it over that 25-year period. And so I think that the problem when you're not looking ahead and looking at the next wave of disruption is by the time you realize it's happening to you, it's too late. So whether that's somebody with my title, or whether it's CEO or the Chief Technology Officers, or better still, all of the management team, you need to have that relentless focus on what's coming next. And that little bit of paranoia in your DNA that you are concerned and interested and curious about what's coming next.
Okay. Another question, who finances citizen news? Do you think that it's objective?
Well, I think it's objective in that the news is uploaded by citizens. It's uploaded by people like you and me. And it's true that there is a filter. In other words, there are people who will check it to make sure that you're not uploading pornography or some violent image. But the news is fundamentally coming from citizens. So I don't worry about propaganda or distortion. In terms of funding, it's a good question. It's a startup, but I'm not sure what the venture capital firms are behind it.
We think I have one more question, but before that, I wanted to add something to the previous one. What worries me about news that all kinds of citizens' news, is that they concentrate, or that it's very easy for citizens to answer at least 5 of the 7 basic journalistic questions of what, where, when. But it's very difficult, especially if it's video, to answer questions about how and why. So don't you think that as we move toward citizens in impact, citizens influence, citizen input, and video input, we're becoming more superficial, and that news jump to conclusions much easier instead of digging in what happened, why things happened, and which is difficult to answer.
I think that's a really great point and a very, very profound point. And I think the short answer is yes. There is that risk. And I think it would be terrible if video was to supplant text, replace text. So I think ideally it's additive rather than substitutive. So it's not substituting text, it's additive to text. But you think about the drama in the US about recently with George Floyd. This black man who was killed by a police officer, captured on a mobile phone video shared on social media. And then you think of what has happened since then, which is this incredible outpouring. You really need the two in conjunction. You need, I think, the written analysis and the contextual information, which I would agree with you. I think it's best served in writing, because that's when, you know, people have to pause and reflect before you put words in writing, particularly if it's for a professional publication where there are editors. And I think that's incredibly important. But in that instance, it's not about the video or the writing, it's the video plus the writing. And I think ideally that's where we're heading with the more sophisticated news outlets.
Let's hope that's the future. Okay, another question about the future is concerning your presentation in the man and machine section. You discussed AI and editors as complementary. Do you think we are witnessing the death of a job of a journalist? Our journalists are going to be to exist in 5 or 10 years as content providers, not as commentators or interviewers or essay writers, but as, you know, the basic content providers, news providers.
Yeah, look, I'm convinced that there's a long-term future for journalism. It's also because people are on demand. And in moments of crisis, such as the one that we're experiencing right now, the demand has gone up. So we've increased, you know, digital subscriptions by more than 350,000 in the past 4 months. And that's because it's not because of any marketing initiative, it's because the demand has surged. And because, you know, consumers realize that you need to have, that sometimes quality news is a matter of life and death. You know, if you're about a significant economic decline, the quality of news that really matters. So I think that we're seeing, in fact, a resurgence in interest in news at the moment. Now, that doesn't take away from the fact that a huge number of journalists have lost jobs over the past 25 years, and there's been significant disruption in the journalism profession. But I think that but you know, you see with some other media, if you look at like the music industry is in decline for 20 years, non-stop decline for 20 years. But in the past 4 years, it's picked up. Why? Because of streaming services, because of Spotify, because of Apple Music. And I think that we'll begin to see a similar pattern in news, where we've had this relentless decline, probably for, now for probably 16, 17 years in journalism. But I believe that we're now beginning to see a bit of a pickup. And we're seeing it in areas such as subscriptions, where people now have a higher propensity to be willing to pay for news than was perhaps the case 3 or 4 years ago.
Why is that so? Why are people willing to pay for news and they weren't 5 years ago?
I think, the media industry, initially it was very unfashionable to charge the end users for news on the internet. And we went through this phase where there's this expression in America, from the tech companies, news wants to be free. So what does that mean? News wants to be free. The crazy expression, news is not a thing. But so there's this incredible pressure to make news available for free. And that got us into a lot of trouble because, the high quality news has a price. Paying for a great journalist, a great editor has a price. And so we educated readers to believe that this is a commodity, something that could be available for free. That model did not work well, and a number of companies had to shift course. I'd hasten to add that the Wall Street Journal is the only company that's had a pay model for the entirety of its web experience. For the past 24 years, it's always asked consumers to pay. We've always had that paying relationship. So we were always very clear in our messaging to consumers that this is something that needs to be paid for. Other companies have followed that shift over the past 5 or 6 years. I think that's one reason. The second reason is technological, ease of payments. It's become easier to pay online. And I think a lot of the some of the reticence of consumers was not necessarily that they didn't want to pay, but it's just, filling out credit card details, maintaining these things is complicated and that they don't want to do it. And then the third reason is the news cycle. The news cycle we've had, some significant political shifts in the US with Trump, in the UK where I'm from. I'm based in New York, but I'm British. I'm a British citizen. With Brexit, more recently with the pandemic, I think that there's been an urgency in the news that has made people feel that the quality of news and the sources that they get has never been more important.
Okay. Next, we have I think it's about $100 million question, which is, what is the next wave of disruption for media?
Well, I think the mobile phone will be the dominant form of consumption for the next 5 years. So that's the first point. So we should get used to the fact that there's nothing coming down on the track that looks like it's going to disrupt the mobile phone. Even during this pandemic, when you might have thought people would be more behind, laptop computers, we've seen increases in mobile phones. So I think the mobile phone is going to remain the dominant form of delivering news for at least the next 5 years. That's the first point. But what we mean by mobile phone is changing all the time. So the ability of a mobile phone to capture video images and for those to be uploaded is significant. And I gave the user case of Citizen, the Citizen app, as one example. And equally, there's the user case of George Floyd and how that's unleashed an incredible story across every media in the world. So I think the power of the mobile phone is becoming greater and greater. So I think the next wave of disruption is going to be on the mobile platform, but it's going to be about the growing importance of both audio and video on that platform. The fact that we're going to be listening to a lot more content on a lot more news-rated content on our mobile phones, and we're going to be consuming a lot more video on mobile phones, and we're going to be sharing a lot more video on mobile phones. So that's where I see the next wave of disruption.
Another question we have is, and I think it's related to the way that people consume news quickly and share them on mobile phones is about the fake news. The fake news, and something which is something that I'm really worried about is deep fake news, which is completely false, made up films of various events. You can have a policeman strangling a black guy on the street, but you can very easily change the skin color and have the black policeman strangling a white guy. It's basically by one click you can do that with the software you have. Do you think that we, meaning the media, can win in the race against the fake and deep fake news, which are very easy to produce and they're very cheap to produce?
Well, I think that one of the most depressing stories of the past 5 years has been the subversive use of social media platforms to distort the democratic process. Whether that's during the 2016 election campaign in the US,
Yes.
whether that's in Brexit, but also in a number of smaller countries, in Ghana, in Trinidad and Tobago, where there isn't a strong strong a local news presence, so they're not as well funded. And this is very, very challenging problem to solve. And in my mind, it means that the value of facts and factual journalism increases. Social media is awash not just with fake news and bot-driven news, but also with opinion that's disguised as fact, which is another form of fake news and also very dangerous. So I think that the media companies that will succeed, I think will be the ones that are really very focused on factual journalism, that whose pledge to the consumers is that we will give you the facts and then you decide. What worries me with some of the media, conventional media, is a trend where you're seeing conventional media mimicking social media. So the New York Times trying to become like a social media platform and blurring the lines between opinion and factual news. And I see this as a very dangerous trend as well. So it's a dangerous trend on social media platforms, but it's also very dangerous when news companies cease to be neutral about the facts and they start telling people what they should believe, which is one step beyond just presenting the news.
I think we have time for two more questions. One is about the citizens' media. Do you think that, and I think in a way it is somehow related to the problem of fake news as well, do you think that they can one day become a threat to professional journalism? Not in a sense, not necessarily in the sense that journalists will be not needed, but the professional journalism will try to imitate the citizens' media.
Yeah, well, look, I think it's a great point, and in my mind, professional journalists need to see themselves as something very distinctive and differentiated from social media. To me, the job of a journalist, and I was a journalist for many years, but the job of the journalist is to discover the facts and then to prove that the facts are true. It's those two things, is to unearth a fact and then to get enough validation to be able to show that the facts are true. That's the job. And what the job isn't is to tell people what they should think. I mean, I think ideally, the more sophisticated media will find that the social media can be helpful, and that the social, particularly the use of video in understanding what's going on in the world around us. And journalists can't be everywhere. In where I'm broadcasting you from Brooklyn, You can probably hear helicopters hovering above me. We're expecting to have demonstrations across the area this evening, maybe potentially some rioting too. Journalists can't be in all places of New York covering that story, but citizens can be. So I think, how professional journalists interplay with the social networks and the content that's uploaded on social networks is incredibly important. But the core job of a journalist needs to be rigorously around checking the facts. In my mind, that's always been the job of the journalist, but I feel like there's been this dangerous shift where journalists have almost tried to imitate social media, and that's a terrible trend.
I try to combine two questions about any new approaches to advertising and content monetization. And another question about what happens if the digital platforms only launch in the markets where they can be profitable. What about the mission to support the democracy for quality media?
Well, I think so far, the technology companies have not invested in the underlying journalism, as in creating journalism itself. So they've been more platforms for distributing journalism, and they've been more platforms for curating journalism. That's good. I don't think they should be in the business of funding journalism because they have too many conflicts. On the other hand, they do have a responsibility for filtering the news, because what stories appear top of your feed is a big responsibility, particularly for a platform like Apple with 900 million users of your iPhone. And I don't think they have the answers yet. And I think that that's a conversation that is urgent and that's urgently required, which is how do you ensure impartiality when these companies have such incredible power to influence our thinking? So I'll leave you with that thought. It's been a real pleasure. And if I can just say that if any of the audience wants to reach out to me, I'm available to you. And I'm a big admirer of the press. I can't unfortunately read Polish, but I have seen presentations about Polish newspapers, and I'm very impressed by a lot of the innovation happening in your country in that realm as well.
Edward, thank you very much. Thank you. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure, and wishing you all well, and wishing you all a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, Edward, thank you very much. It was really a great 10th webinar of We Innovators Club, and we are very happy that you had the time to be with us. Thanks a lot. I hope that media of future will be better than we think.
I hope so too. We must remain positive, and I hope so too.
Yeah, my wife is a journalist, and all the time she says that the journalism is not good thing to do now, and she says that there is no journalist now. So
well, I think journalism will continue to be a great profession, and tell your wife she's doing a very important job, and
I hope so.
We need her to to keep doing it. Great to meet you, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay. Thank you. Hope see you in the future. And I would like to show now the film you couldn't see. I hope it will be easier and it will be better now. Paweł, would you like to say something? Thank you, Grzegorz, for great moderation. I would like to Claudia to show us her job. Claudia?
Yes, just 1 second. I'm doing it.
Okay.
All right, there we are. There you go.
Okay.
So these are the these
I
are
think
the
that we can switch into Polish because Edward has to go to another meeting. So
All right.
it will be easier for everybody. Opowiadaj.
Tak, czyli no to muszę się teraz przestawić.
Wiem, że miałem zejść.
No to co? To
To są 2 godziny w ciągu 7 dni. To nie jest
Paweł?
jakiś...
Paweł, wyłącz dźwięk.
Przepraszam?
To mała awantura rodzinna.
Normalne. Wszyscy jesteśmy ludźmi i pewnie wszyscy w domach. No, więc tak, no jest sekcja z trendami wypisane, o których mówił Edward, sekcja z ważnymi pytaniami, powiedziałabym, i z takimi myślami, które wyłapałam jako istotne. No i powiedziałabym, że ważna myśl, że no, mimo wszystko, mimo tego, że giganci technologicznie nas atakują i może próbują zastąpić albo wpływać jakoś na informacje, no to jednak potrzebujemy nadal cały czas profesjonalnego dziennikarstwa i oby tak pozostało. Także tyle.
Dzięki wielkie. Dziękujemy przede wszystkim publiczności. Fajnie, że ciągle z nami jesteście, że przychodzicie na spotkania, już niedługo kolejne, a ja puszczam film, którego nie udało mi się puścić. Paweł, czy możesz powiedzieć kilka słów, czy już nie? Paweł też uciekł, już nie może wystąpić. Okej, słuchajcie, wszystkiego dobrego, udanego weekendu, do zobaczenia. Mam nadzieję, że teraz i z dźwiękiem, i z wizją. Dziękuję Wam wszystkim bardzo.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Dzięki uprzejmie. Dzięki wielkie. Grzegorz, świetna robota. Klaudia, świetna robota. Dziękuję. Niestety, Grzegorz, znowu mówisz po cichu.
Tylko mówiłem dziękuję bardzo.
Dziękuję.
Muszę się nauczyć.
Trzymajcie się wszyscy. Udanego wieczoru.
Cześć, do zobaczenia.
Dzięki.
Do zobaczenia.
Hej.